Really happy to be here to talk with you today, and what this is all about is I'm going to help you to make your communications have more impact. So that's going to be useful for you not only professionally at business, but also personally as well. For example, you may want to use the skills of persuasion you'll learn here to maybe convince your significant other to take you on that trip to Italy you've always wanted. You know, they're definitely skills that apply everywhere. And also to real formal, structured types of presentations. There's going to be a lot of help for that, as well as just informal communications. Could be even a one-on-one. So you'll find that the skills will really apply very broadly. And we're going to talk about three major categories here because we've got a short period of time, but we can get a lot done. So one of them is the communication sweet spot. We'll talk about what that looks like. Then we'll also talk about how to have a very engaging delivery, and then also to have a very impactful content. And it's really where the delivery, the behaviors you exhibit, and the content you have, when those are both very effective, that's what creates a really powerful communication or presentation. So taking a look at this, a single idea can start a groundswell, be a flashpoint for a movement, and it can rewrite our future. If you communicate in a way that resonates, change will happen. And you know, we can have a brilliant idea, but if you can't communicate it in an impactful way, it doesn't go anywhere. So it's so incredibly important. You can see all of these people across the board here. You know, these are people throughout history who have hit the sweet spot of communication and had a lot of impact that even did create some major change in some instances. But these people, some of them are celebrities, some of them are businessmen or women, and some of them are politicians. But what they all do have in common is that they did hit the communications sweet spot. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. How many of you earlier this year heard Oprah's speech at the Golden Globes? At least maybe almost half of you, at least a third of you. Yeah, that was only 9 minutes long. But talk about impact, because afterwards, Twitter and Facebook were just blowing up with what? Oprah for president. So clearly a lot of impact there in that 9-minute presentation because she hit that sweet spot. The same with Bill Clinton. He was known as an excellent communicator throughout his career. And I absolutely love this comment made by a Republican who said, "I hated him before I met him. I hated him after I met him. But when I was with him, I just love the guy." You know? So again, really hitting that sweet spot in terms of communication. So this research backs this up. It says 2 qualities account for more than 90% of the impressions that others form of us. So what are those 2 things? What are those 2 qualities that create that communication sweet spot? It's warmth and it's competence. So with warmth, we're talking about likability. Do you like this person? Are they giving off a good impression? Do you feel like you can trust them? Do you feel like you can connect with this person? And it's so important because we've got to like somebody before we'll even listen to them. So likability, warmth, very, very important. And we will be talking about ways to convey that. On the other hand, competence is equally important. Does the person appear knowledgeable? Do they seem confident about what they're saying? Do they appear passionate about what they're saying? You know, we make first impressions very quickly. So when we are assessing somebody, when somebody gets up to talk, you're immediately making a judgment. Is this person worth listening to or not? So very, very important that we keep that in mind when we're the ones doing the talking. So how do we exhibit warmth and competence? Well, we communicate it in 3 ways. I call these the 3 V's. So through the verbals, the vocals, and the visuals. Now, when I say verbal, what I'm talking about is content, the words I'm using, the words themselves. When I'm talking about vocal, it's what is my vocal tone like? And when I'm talking visual, it's how do I look when I say it? What's the body language that I'm giving off? And there is no better way to bring this to light for you, other than to show you an example. So I've got a great clip. It's actually a debate that was taking place between Bush and Clinton, who have very different styles, as you may remember. So what I want you to look for, in fact, what I'll do is, to get you all engaged here, I'm going to kind of cut the room up into thirds. How about that? So let me see, maybe the first 3 rows here, this whole section here. What I'd like you to look for in this videotape is the verbals, the contents themselves between Bush and Clinton. Think about what are they doing through their words to convey warmth and competence, or to undermine it, on the other hand, right? And then why don't we take, let's see, so the 2 rows here and maybe the 2 rows here, and you can look, I lost my slide there. Are we okay? And the 2, you can look for, let's do the visuals. So what are you seeing in terms of the body language from both of these men to convey warmth and confidence or to undermine it? And then for you, these 4 rows here, look at the vocals. Look at the tone. What are you picking up in terms of the tone? So if you'll look for that, let's take a look at this clip, and then we'll debrief. Okay.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? And if it hasn't, how can you honestly find a cure for the economic problems of the common people if you have no experience in what's ailing them?
Well, I think the national debt affects everybody. Obviously, it has a lot to do with interest rates. It has.
She's saying you personally.
On a personal basis, how has it affected you?
Has it affected you personally?
Well, I'm sure it has. I love my grandchildren. I want to think that they're going to be able to afford an education. I think that that's an important part of being a parent. Maybe I won't get it wrong. Are you suggesting that if somebody has means, that the national debt doesn't affect them?
Oh, what I'm saying,
I'm not sure I get it. Help me with the question, and I'll try to answer it.
I've had friends that have been laid off from jobs.
Yeah.
I know people who cannot afford to pay the mortgage on their homes, their car payment. I have personal problems with the national debt. But how has it affected you? And if you have no experience in it, how can you help us if you don't know what we're feeling?
I think she means more the recession, the economic problems today the country faces, rather than the deficit.
You ought to be in the White House for a day and hear what I hear and see what I see and read the mail I read and touch the people that I touch from time to time. I was in the Lomax AME church. It's a black church just outside of Washington, D.C. And I read in the bulletin about teenage pregnancies, about the difficulty that families are having to make ends meet. I talked to parents. I mean, you got to care. Everybody cares if people aren't doing well. But I don't think it's fair to say you haven't had cancer, therefore you don't know what it's like. I don't think it's fair to say, whatever it is, if you haven't been hit by it personally, but everybody's affected by the debt. Because of the tremendous interest that goes into paying on that debt, everything's more expensive. Everything comes out of your pocket and my pocket. So it's that. But I think in terms of the recession, of course you feel it when you're President of the United States. And that's why I'm trying to do something about it by stimulating the export, investing more, better education systems. Thank you. I'm glad to clarify.
Tell me how it's affected you again. You know people who've lost their jobs and lost their homes? Well, I've been governor of a small state for 12 years. I'll tell you how it's affected me. Every year, Congress and the President sign laws that make us do more things and gives us less money to do it with. I see people in my state, middle-class people, their taxes have gone up in Washington and their services have gone down, while the wealthy have gotten tax cuts. I have seen what's happened in this last 4 years. When in my state, when people lose their jobs, there's a good chance I'll know them by their names. When a factory closes, I know the people who ran it. When the businesses go bankrupt, I know them. And I've been out here for 13 months, meeting in meetings just like this, ever since October, with people like you all over America. People that have lost their jobs, lost their livelihood, lost their health insurance. What I want you to understand is the national debt is not the only cause of that. It is because America has not invested in its people. It is because we have not grown. It is because we've had 12 years of trickle-down economics. We've gone from 1st to 12th in the world in wages. We've had 4 years where we produced no private sector jobs. Most people are working harder for less money than they were making 10 years ago. It is because we are in the grip of a failed economic theory. And this decision you're about to make better be about what kind of economic theory you want. Not just people saying, I'm going to go fix it, but what are we going to do? What I think we have to do is invest in American jobs, American education, control American health care costs, and bring the American people together again.
Kind of a contrast, wouldn't you say? So starting over here with this side of the room, these 4 rows, we were looking for the content, the words that were actually being said. So who can tell me something that, that you noticed that either promoted warmth and competence or undermined it? You had your hand up first. Clinton? Yeah. 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 Yeah, Clinton really kind of met them where they were and talked about, yes, I can relate to this. I even know the names of people that have been laid off. And so he did that connecting, you know, and the warmth and making it a little bit more personal. Yeah, what else?
So Bush was showing competence in a sense of very dry and academic competences.
Mm-hmm.
You know, here's how the national debt affects people. It was very impersonal.
Yeah, so appealing more to the logic.
He was not meeting her where she wanted to be met. He was meeting her from Washington, D.C. almost. You know, that's
right.
And you had, obviously not on the physical aspect, but if you combine the words and the physical aspect, it was very clear that he was coming from a distant place.
Yeah.
Not from a place of closeness.
Yeah, that's kind of the feeling you had, that this person's a little bit more removed, right? Yeah. And you had a comment.
His ending where he used American this, American, I don't even know what it was, but said it 3 times. That was like he created a content soundbite and punctuated what he was saying incredibly well, right?
Yeah. And if you even pick apart some of the words themselves, you know, it's very interesting. With Bush, you heard things like, you know, that's not fair, you know, or you should be in the White House, you know, so kind of some words around that, whereas Clinton was asking questions, you know, seeking to understand. So it has a very different effect. It really it felt a little bit that way, didn't it? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So when we get to tone, I would agree it had that defensive tone. So thank you. Yeah, good observations. And how about over in here? What did you pick up in terms of the body language, the visuals? Yes.
Well, Clinton actually spoke to her. He looked at
yes.
her the whole time.
Yeah.
To her, where Bush was looking around and walking around, and Clinton walked up.
Yes. Great catches. Yeah. Those things really add up. So yeah, what you saw was Bush was staying more removed, kind of backed up a little bit, whereas Clinton was coming right in, making it very personal and really connecting through some real eye communication there. So again, really setting up that warmth and that connection. You had a, yeah.
Bush at the very beginning had a really interesting almost arrogance come across, and standing up and pulling up the pants and the self-centered big boy swagger. They continued throughout a lot of it in that distancing himself from the audience.
Yeah.
Facial expressions too.
Facial expressions. Yeah. What did you see on the facial?
Furrowed brow.
Yeah.
For Bush pretty much the whole time, and then kind of leading to like confounded with that little
yeah.
snap at the end, like, why am I here?
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add to that, he looked at his watch when he just got out.
Twice. Yeah, 2 different times. Like, I can't be bothered. This is taking my time. Yeah.
I mean, they both used their
yes.
finger, but one really was more like...
In a different way. In a different way. Yeah, I noticed that too. So what you saw a lot with Bush, it was this. And that almost feels parental, doesn't it? It almost feels a little punitive. Whereas with Clinton, it was kind of more this thing, like emphasizing points. So yeah, you're picking up some very important cues. And then what about over here in terms of the vocals, the tone? What did you pick up there?
So in the very beginning, when Clinton stepped up, his voice was softer, quieter.
Yeah.
His pace of speaking was slower.
Yes.
To just sort of disarm her and invite her in.
Yeah, it wasn't like, yeah, let me just think of the best answer to fit this. You know, there was that warmth, and even combining it with placing the hand on the heart. It's like, well, let me tell you, you know, what I've experienced. Yeah.
I actually think he even took it through an arc where he started with sort of the doctor, the help you, the mother, a very kind of comforting tone, and then he led into the activist, like, what are we going to do? And he got very confident and very specific and drove the points home.
That's really good, and that's something that's really important for all of you as you're in those kind of positions, which is that first you want to connect, you want that warmth and that connection, and then you lead. And that's exactly what he was doing. It's like meeting them right there where they were, ground level, and this is where we've got to go. This is where you want to take them. And that's what you want to do in your presentations and communications as well. So you can see that, by themselves, they might all seem like little things, but they sure add up to a picture and a feeling which you get. One was more off-putting, and the other one hit that sweet spot that we talked about. Okay, so that's about the communication sweet spot, and then I said we would also talk about content and delivery. So we're going to start with the content, so the verbal, that's what we mean by that. And let's take a look at what's important with content. So basically what you want to appeal to is you're looking at two things, pathos and logos. And if you remember this from literature in college, pathos is appealing to the emotion and logos is appealing to logic. They're both important, but a lot of people get stuck right here on the logic. A lot of data, a lot of facts, a lot of figures. Now it's important to have some of that for credibility, for sure, but you need to wrap around it an appeal to the emotion. There's something that I read a few years ago, and it always stuck with me, and I absolutely think it's true. It was a quote, and it said, logic makes you think, but emotion makes you act. And what that brings to mind is think about the last big purchase you may have made. Most of us buy on emotion. So if it was, say, a car or a house, it's like, yeah, you want the car that gets good mileage and that's maybe safe, but you're going to buy the one that makes your heart go pitter-pat, right? So it's really important that we wrap an appeal to the emotion into our communications. And one of the best ways to do this is by knowing your audience. I always say that is the most important piece of any presentation or communication you do. Who's your listener? You've got to think about the listener and customize or adapt to that particular listener. So more specifically, most speakers think in terms of what do I want to say? What idea do I want to convey? But the best speakers think, what does my audience need to hear? So it seems subtle, but it's a world of difference. So that should be the first place you start as you prepare anything, if it's going to be something more formal, is who is my listener, who's my audience? Oh, that wasn't supposed to come up at the same time. So this wasn't supposed to be seen. So now I can't ask you a question about it. But anyway, a good illustration of this, about knowing your listener, your audience, back in the 80s in Texas. Anyone from Texas? Yeah, OK, we got a few. So back in the 80s, huge pollution problem, litter everywhere, millions of dollars being spent to clean it up and also to campaign about not littering. And so they got the same marketing company that came up with Smokey the Bear, who came up with Woodsy the Owl. Give a hoot, don't pollute. So what do you think happened? Did everyone stop littering and polluting? Not at all. No change. Well, that's not even true. There was a change. Littering went up. I don't know why, but it certainly didn't drop. So they realized this was a lesson. It's like, aha, we don't know our audience. Who's our audience? And what they found was their littering audience tended to be males, 18 to 35, very masculine, lots of Texas pride. So then they came up with, and this is where I was going to say, do you remember? They came up with Don't Mess with Texas. Remember that? So that worked. And over 4 years, pollution dropped by 80%. It was phenomenal. And not only did the polluters stop littering, they had so much Texas pride, and they really tied into the slogan. They're getting on other people's case for doing it, going, don't be dirtying up our state. Don't mess with Texas. So it really became very effective just by really knowing your listeners and what appeals to them. So a very important point. So in terms of knowing the audience, you want to know what motivates them and what their level of knowledge is when you make your delivery or just communicate informally with them. So for example, I like to start my day with 20 minutes of meditation. It kind of helps me create my day in a positive way. So if I wanted to talk to you about the importance of meditation, my point of view would be, hey, it's essential that you meditate in the beginning of the day. But I would need to know what is it that motivates this particular audience. If I'm talking to a lot of corporate people like you, I would probably hit to the fact that if you meditate, it's going to give you more productivity throughout the day. That's like, yeah, it might take a few minutes, but you're going to get so much more done. Whereas if I'm talking to somebody who's going to give a presentation, I might talk about how it can reduce your nerves and keep anxiety down. So it's really, the what's in it for this particular audience. So really important to think about. And of course, what's their level of knowledge? Are they already, somewhat expert in this? Are they lay people? So you want to consider that as well. But not only that, you also need to think about where might they resist, where might they have an objection. You want to think that through ahead of time and have some answers ready. So for example, I know that something that's going to come up is, I don't have the time. I'm already too busy. So then I might say, well, 20 minutes is ideal, but research shows that even 5 minutes can make a difference. Well, I don't have 5 minutes. Well, you know what? You could do it in the shower. You could do it on your commute into work. So really think about what potential resistance you can encounter as well when you're thinking through your content. And really be clear on what your goal is. You don't want to just be using a bunch of words. Generally, the goal is around one of three things. It's how do you want the person you're talking to think? How do you want them to feel? Or how do you want them to act? In other words, what do you want them to do? So back to the meditation example, I want you to start meditating. That would be my goal. And so I'm going to give you all kinds of what's in it for yous and benefits in order to accomplish that. So that's a good way to think about structuring it and having a really strong point of view so that, whether it's a couple hours from now or a few days from now, people will remember what that was all about. It's the one big thing that you really want them to remember, that point of view. All right, and storytelling. So in terms of content, Chip Heath from Stanford, who wrote Made to Stick. How many of you have read Made to Stick? Yeah, a lot of you. I've read it 2 times on an airplane. It's a really easy read for those of you who haven't read it. It's very anecdotal. It goes really quickly, and he's got some great ideas. He actually comes up with the big 6 things to do to make your message sticky. In other words, memorable. But I'm going to tell you what the #1 thing is here in this class. But what he also found, he studied a lot of speeches, and he studied a lot of marketing campaigns. He found that the #1 mistake people make is making the message too abstract. In other words, there's just too many concepts, too many conclusions. If you go into too much verbal data, like I always envision a pile of papers and books. Too much data, it's going to have this effect on your audience. So not making it too abstract. Instead, making it concrete with examples and stories. So that's what really brings a communication alive. It's what makes it memorable or sticky, to use Heath's words. So I'm going to show you an example of that. So this is Steve Jobs, and his point of view is ask for help. Along the way, as you're moving up the corporate ladder or whatever, ask for help, get a mentor, that type of thing. So that's his point of view. But if he just said that, ask for help, you probably wouldn't really remember that. It probably wouldn't really prompt you to answer. It's like, well, yeah, okay, sure, ask for help. But watch how he uses a personal story and example to make it really jump out at you, make it come alive. Okay.
I've actually always found something to be very true, which is most people don't get those experiences because they never ask. I've never found anybody that didn't want to help me if I asked them for help. I always call them up. I called up, this will date me, but I called up Bill Hewlett when I was 12 years old, and he lived in Palo Alto. His number was still in the phone book. And he answered the phone himself. He said, yes? He said, hi, I'm Steve Jobs. I'm 12 years old. I'm a student in high school, and I want to build a frequency counter. And I was wondering if you had any spare parts I could have. And he laughed, and he gave me the spare parts to build this frequency counter, and he gave me a job that summer in Hewlett-Packard, working on the assembly line, putting nuts and bolts together on frequency counters. He got me a job in the place that built them. And I was in heaven. And I've never found anyone who said no or hung up the phone when I called. I just asked. And when people ask me, I try to be as responsive, to pay that debt of gratitude back. Most people never pick up the phone and call. Most people never ask. And that's what separates sometimes the people that do things from the people that just dream about them.
Okay, so you can see how that's going to make it memorable. You're going to remember the story that Steve Jobs, as a 12-year-old, called Bill Hewlett and asked him for some help. That we can remember, right? And because we'll remember that, that'll tie us back to his point of view, which was ask for help, right? So that's how it works. lace and pepper your communications with stories, and you're going to have memorability for sure. And it'll bring back to that point of view. So Chip Heath says, if you do only one thing, tell stories. Research backs this up as well. It has been found that if you include stories, that makes the data 22 times more memorable. That's amazing. Not sure how they got at that, but it is in the research. It also makes a more favorable impression on you, the speaker. And it also has double the impact. And this was studied based on the campaign about Save the Children. So when they were just giving data and trying to fundraise and saying, hey, there's a lot of hungry, go ahead and donate. Once they actually personalized it with stories and highlighted a couple of hungry children, showing you them, then it really doubled what they were getting. Just like those commercials with the animals and all that. That's a lot more effective. Again, that's appealing to the emotion. But it's also using personal stories. Look at this puppy, or look at this child. Yeah. So the last thing I'll say about content is it's always helpful to have sort of an outline or a structure to your communication. And a really simple and easy way to do it is to make sure you have the headline. Again, that's your point of view. So with Steve Jobs, the point of view was what? Just ask. Yeah, ask for help. And then he used a personal example, calling Bill Hewlett. And then the other part is relevance. What's the so what here? Like, why does this matter? Well, in the case with, again, back to the Steve Jobs example, the relevance was, hey, this separates the achievers from the dreamers, right? So if you think about it in those 3 easy steps, then you've got something that has some weight to it. Any questions on the content before we go into delivery? OK. We're going to move into how to have an engaging delivery. All right. And when we talk about delivery, we're going to talk about the visuals and the vocals. So what you see, the body language, and my tone. Professor Morabian came from UCLA, and he studied the 3 V's extensively and found that of the verbal, vocal, and visual, the tone you use, the vocals, and the visuals, your body language, actually has more impact than the words themselves, which seems very counterintuitive, and it does not mean that content doesn't matter. But what it does mean is that when they're out of alignment, we're going to believe what we see and what we hear over what words I use. So for example, if I started off today saying, I'm really excited to be here today to talk about communications. It's just so important in terms of having impact. Are you going to believe that I'm excited to talk about it? I said I am. I gave you the words. But you're going to really look at my body language, and you're going to look at my tone and think differently. Just like when we saw the Bush versus the Clinton. And Bush said at one point, hey, of course I care. We care. But did we believe it? Not necessarily, because that tone sounded condescending and aggravated. So that's what we're going to believe. So again, all important, but they need to go together. They need to all coalesce, for sure. And so not Morabian, but another study broke apart the best speeches of history and found, in terms of impact, that 27%, or the highest impact, came from the passion and energy that the speaker conveyed. Next up was knowledgeable. Not that they necessarily were, but that they conveyed that they were. And then the vocals accounted for 1/4 of the impact of the message, so your tone and your vocal variety. And then presence was up next, and again, so last, 11%, the content. Again, totally important, but they all need to match up. And some of these things, like your vocal tone, that should match the content in terms of if you might want to have a more powerful voice if you're giving some important data. You might want to have, maybe a softer, more empathetic voice if you're trying to convey sympathy. So that's another area where it needs to match. It needs to go together. OK, so in terms of the nonverbals, because that's where we are now, talking about the nonverbals, let's watch this. This is very funny. It's a TED Talk. Like I said, it's got a lot of humor in it. But he really highlights the importance of the nonverbal cues. So let's take a look.
Hear that? That's nothing. Which is what I, as a speaker at today's conference, have for you all. I have nothing. Nada. Zip. Zilch. Zippo. Nothing smart. Nothing inspirational. Nothing even remotely researched at all. I have absolutely nothing to say whatsoever. And yet, through my manner of speaking, I will make it seem like I do. Like what I am saying is brilliant. And maybe, just maybe, you will feel like you've learned something. Now, I'm going to get started with the opening. I'm going to make a lot of hand gestures. I'm going to do this with my right hand. I'm going to do this with my left. I'm going to adjust my glasses. And then I'm going to ask you all a question. By show of hands, how many of you all have been asked a question before? OK, great. I'm seeing some hands. And again, I have nothing here. Now, I'm going to react to that and act like I'm telling you a personal anecdote. Something to break the tension. Something to endear myself a little bit. Something kind of embarrassing. And you guys are going to make an awe sound. It's true. It really happened. And now I'm going to bring it to a broader point. I'm going to reel you back in. I'm going to make it intellectual. I'm going to bring it to this man right here. Now, what this man did was important, I'm sure. But I, for one, have no idea who he is. I simply Google image the word scientist. And now, you see, I'd like it to seem like I'm making points, building an argument, inspiring you to change your life, when in reality, this is just me buying time. Now,
don't you love it? So yes, talking about the nonverbal cues, so the visuals and the vocals. What did he do vocally and visually that made this a dynamic presentation, engaging? Yeah, the vocal variety. Yeah, bringing the voice up and down so it wasn't just monotone. Yeah. What else? Yeah, the gestures, expressive face. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, ooh, we'll talk about that. That's so important for credibility. So yeah, so he did a lot of good things vocally and visually to make this dynamic, even though it was a Twinkie, it was just air. You know? So let's break this down. We're going to talk first about visual. In terms of the visuals, the body language, you want to be big in terms of taking up space, big and balanced, as well as open and connected. So in terms of connecting to your audience, and we talked about that with the sweet spot too, about the warmth. So one of the best ways to really engage your audience and make them feel connected is through your eye contact. You noticed that, a couple of you, with Bill Clinton versus George Bush. So what you want to do is really connect. And in fact, that was another comment that was made about Bill Clinton. Somebody said, after he had given this huge speech presentation, they said, you were speaking to 10,000 people, but you had everybody in the palm of your hand. How did you do it? And he said, because I wasn't talking to 10,000 people. I was having one conversation at a time, a few seconds at a time. It was just you and me talking right here, having our own conversation. Now I'm going to look over here, and it's just you and me. That also helps you reduce your nerves, by the way, and anxiety, to think about it that way. But if you can do that, you know, there are still classes that teach, if you're nervous, look over their heads, just look above them to the back of the room. Now, do you all feel connected to me as I do this? You can tell, it's not a good technique. So what you want to do is give a rule of thumb is about 5 seconds of eye contact per person. Not that you can look at everybody in the room. You're going to pick out a few people. But even if I'm looking at you right now, the people sitting around you think that I'm looking at them anyway. So just think about it. I'm going to give you 5 seconds. I'm going to plant a thought with you. Then I'm going to move on to you for my next sentence. And just doing it like that. Because you want to get away from the eye dart. You know, I can say I'm giving you all eye contact if I'm doing this. But if I'm just darting around the room, you're not going to feel connected either. So that's one of the best ways to connect. Another really great way to convey warmth and connection is through a smile. Really warms up the presentation, enhances that likability. So smiling as you're talking, or at least showing expression through your face. I think you mentioned that there was a lot of expression in this last presentation. And yeah, it's that lifting the eyebrows, the twinkle in the eye. Because what we're trying to get away from is that impassive, I really don't give a darn face. You know, that's what we want to get away from. Or even worse, the RBF, as you probably know what I'm talking about. Resting bitchy face, where it's just the furrowed brow. Because some people do that as they're processing, but it's very off-putting. So if you're one of those, I was coaching somebody on that. So you want to have that open face. So those are some great ways to connect with your audience. And then in terms of taking up space and being big and balanced and really showing off executive presence, gestures is one of the best ways you can do it. And also just how you stand. So right now, why don't everybody stand up. I'm going to teach you a good ready position, a home base, for when you're doing a presentation, a formal presentation. So You might not like it and might feel uncomfortable, but it looks good, and that's what matters. So, so what you're going to do is you want to put your feet about hip width apart. And, of course, great posture. So shoulders back, because, again, that helps make you big. You don't want to be here. You want to be here. So shoulders back, hip width. And then the biggest question is, what do I do with my hands? What do I do with my hands? Now, I'm going to have this part of the room. You guys face them, and you guys turn around and face them. I want you all to face each other. Because you're going to say, oh, this feels terrible, and it's awkward. But I want you to see how good it looks. So, so when you're standing like this, drop your hands comfortably, not tin soldier, but at your sides like this. This is home base. This is a ready position. As awkward as it may feel to you, look across the room and tell me how it looks. Does it look confident? They look great. Looking good. All right, awesome. You can sit down. So that's important because we see so many awkward positions, and it pulls away from power and executive presence. So over the years, these are the most common things I see because I do a lot of videotaping of clients, you know, in my communications training. So I'll see, I call this the Sisters of Mercy. I see this with women, with women a lot. We'll see the ring twisters, you know, this right here, the wounded paw sometimes. A favorite among men is the fig leaf. And I know you're being protective, but one of the strangest ones I ever saw was a guy who started off with the fig leaf, and then every time he emphasized a point, he went like that. So I call that the flashing fig leaf. So there's all these things, but none of them really look confident. And the one I've noticed on TV hosts, like if you're watching what is it, Survivor or The Bachelor or those shows, I noticed they all do this spider thing, you know, where they're like standing like this. So they must have been told that this looks like a good ready position, but it doesn't look natural, does it? It just looks bizarre. So this would be where you are, and if you're not here, you should be gesturing. So your arms should only be in two places, one of two. Here. And if you need to get used to this because it feels so weird, just try practicing it with your friends and with your kids at home when you're talking to them in the kitchen. Just start putting your hands down so you can get used to it. And if they're not there, they should be gesturing and gesturing big. Because again, you want to take up the space, you want to have the power, you want to have the presence. Most people do not do that. People tend to gesture very small. They like to stay kind of in this area right here, and they do this, which looks like a T-Rex, which is not power. That's not a good look. So what you want to do instead is open up your frame. You want to gesture nice and big. There's three things I'm going to talk to you guys about today. First, we're going to talk about delivery, and then we're going to talk about content. You know what? From where we started, we've grown about this much. So it's really getting those hands out, and again, that's just something that you can practice. So yes.
Are you going to have time for Q&A at the end? Or?
Yes, and I know it's getting close. I have what, like 8 minutes left, something like that. I'm going to stick around. So anybody who has any questions, I'd be happy to help you on anything. So yeah, so thinking about the bolder gestures, it always makes me remember. How many of you have seen Talladega Nights? Ricky Bobby? Yeah, remember that scene? So with the media, they are filming him, and thank you. They're filming him, and he goes, I don't know what to do with my hands. So now you know, here or here. So the other thing you can do to have executive presence and take up space and look big and powerful is movement. Because there's nothing worse than watching a presentation where the person just stands behind the lectern and they never move. But it has to be movement with purpose, because you also don't want to be distracting and, you know, like I'm moving over here, and then as soon as I get here, I'm going to move. The first concert I ever saw back in the 80s with Linda Ronstadt, she didn't know how to move yet on the stage, and that's what she did. She kind of skipped over here, and then she skipped back. And I always think about that, because it's like, it has to have purpose. So what you want to do is tie it to your eye contact. So if I'm on this side of the room, I'm going to look at you. I'm going to plant an idea, a thought with you. I'll have that eye connection. I'm going to look at you for 5 seconds, plant an idea, and then maybe I'll look at you. So maybe 3 or 4 people over here. It's time to move. So to get you over to the other side, latch on to somebody on this side and walk towards them. So I'm connecting now with you, and I'm going to walk towards you as I'm talking and walking. And then I'm going to plant myself, because I don't want to keep moving. So I've got to root myself, and I'm going to stay here and now give a few other people you know, a sentence each so that I'm connecting that way. And then after I've spent some time over here, I'll do the same thing. I'm going to look over here. I've got you. And now it's kind of like fishing. I always feel like, you know, throwing out the pole, reeling it in. And that's how you can do it. But don't forget to plant. Otherwise, again, that's distracting. And the same thing, you know, if you're sitting down, You can make yourself big. I know women particularly tend to, cross the legs and hand in lap, and it makes you look small. This is just sort of a small, shrinking violet look. So better is to put your feet like this, definitely for the men. If you're wearing a skirt or dress, you can cross at the ankles like this. So either there or here. And instead of this, again, that frame, that upper frame, expansive shoulders. And if you're at a desk talking to somebody, you can rest your hands on the desk. If you don't have a desk, at least kind of resting them out here so that you can still do some gestures as well. Because if you get stuck here, you're not going to be gesturing. So that's how it might apply in a seated situation. Let's see. Given time, I think I'm going to move on. Yeah, it's loud over there. They sound like they're having fun. Okay, and then in terms of the vocals, first let me show you an example. I love this. This is Margaret Thatcher, who was known for her voice and her speaking. In fact, they said that her voice was one of her most potent political weapons, but it wasn't always that way. And that's another thing I should mention is that, you might think about somebody that you know at your company that's just this great speaker. Most speakers aren't born that way. It takes a lot of, practice and training. Even Steve Jobs admits that it was all about the practice and the training. So same with Margaret Thatcher. So what we're going to look at is her maiden speech, her first speech when she entered office, and then 20 years later, after a lot of training, and take a look at the difference.
Mrs. Thatcher, it's always supposed to be a tremendous ordeal, maiden speech. Was it for you?
Oh, very much so. I've done a good deal of other speaking, but speaking in the House of Commons is quite different. It's a unique experience.
Maiden speech, and now we'll get a little clip from her many years later.
To those waiting with bated breath for that favorite media catchphrase, the U-turn, I have only one thing to say. U-turn if you want to. The ladies, not for turning.
In the second one, she just exhibits so much more power. And the way she does that is through pausing. She'll say something and then just pause. And her cadence, it's just very, very measured. She has the vocal variety. She brings some humor in there. So it was, even though the first one wasn't bad, there was such a change from the second one. And it really shows the importance of vocals. Okay, so in terms of the vocals, what you want to look for is warmth and variety. So when I'm talking about vocal variety, that's kind of what you mentioned before when we were looking at Bush and Clinton, that you want the voice to go up and down, kind of like a roller coaster, because you're trying to get away from Bueller, that monotone classic voice. So you want to vary the pitch so you're not monotone. You want to vary the volume, so it's not all like way up here or all too quiet, which we're going to lose some energy around. So it's good to kind of vary that. If I have an important point that I want to really highlight, I either want my voice to maybe get louder or softer, something that's different, because that's going to spike attention. So yeah, thinking about that. And then the warmth, conveying warmth through your voice. One of the best ways you can do that is through speaking through your diaphragm, because most of us speak up here, especially when we're nervous. When you get nervous, you start shallow breathing a little bit like that. You're breathing kind of quickly, and your voice starts coming from up here, and it gets high and a little bit tinny, and it can do something called vocal fry. It doesn't sound powerful. So the best thing to do is speak from the diaphragm, and the best way to speak from the diaphragm is to breathe from the diaphragm, because if you breathe from it, you're going to speak that way as well. And what that really means is, and it's kind of counterintuitive, a lot of people feel like when you breathe in, your stomach would go out, or stomach would go in, but it's supposed to go the opposite way for diaphragmatic breathing. So here, I'll let you see my belly. This is really embarrassing, but I'll do it for you guys. I'm taking one. So if I breathe in, I'm going to have my stomach go out, like blowing up. So it's like that, and then so it's exhaling, blowing out the air of the balloon and bringing it back in. So if you take a few of those deep breaths before you do, say, a presentation, first of all, that lowers the cortisol in your body. So it actually reduces anxiety, but it also gets that fuller voice. It gets that richer, more powerful voice. So there's actually an app. It's called Voice Bunny that will help you with that. It will give you practices for speaking from the diaphragm. So that's something to check out as well. And then pace and power. Pace is so, so important, and I know one of you mentioned about the pause, and I think it was you, and I said that's so important. You want to, whoa, okay, I have a couple minutes. So you definitely want to infuse your talk with pause. You don't want to just race through the presentation, because you want your audience to absorb what you're saying. And the best way to get rid of the ums and uhs, because that's a killer for credibility. You know, like, you know, the best way to get rid of those is to pause instead, because most of us use those non-words, those fillers between sentences. So think about putting the period at the end of your sentence verbally and pause. So after you say something important, you know, this doubled the impact. You know, wait, let it sink in before you just bulldoze over it with more information. All right, so tools for practice. We're at the end. Yay, made it. So some things, some apps that you might want to look at. I'm trying to remember the name of this one. This is called Vocal Warm-Up. That will actually help you with exercises to warm up your voice for if you're doing a formal presentation. Like So, that is actually a good app for helping you get rid of those ums and uhs, the non-words. Voice Vibes, this is awesome, because what that does is you can actually upload a presentation that you have taped of yourself, and it gives you feedback on your pace, on your vocal variety, and they'll even give you some words to describe the tone, like, you know what, you sounded condescending, or you sounded really friendly. So this one's really particularly cool. So yeah, if you want to take a picture of that, I would encourage you to do so. And so just in a quick review, we talked about 3 things today. The communication sweet spot. What are the 2 big factors? Warmth and confidence. That's right. We talked about an engaging delivery through your vocals, through your gestures, connecting through the eyes and through the smile, having that pause. And then we talked about impactful content. What was the one thing Chip Heath says to do? Put a story in there, and among some other things. But those, you guys were good listeners. So that's kind of a quick and dirty review there. So just the last thing I was going to say is you can think about the delivery as getting it off the ground so that people will even listen to you in the first place. And then the content is getting them where you want them to go. Again, how do you want them to think, feel, or act? And according to Steve Jobs, the best thing you can do, if you've got something coming up that you're going to be speaking in front of somebody, videotape yourself. Practice, practice, practice is what he says. And he used to practice tons of times before he would get up and talk, even though it seemed very off the cuff. So something you might want to try is videotape yourself giving your presentation, because it's different saying it out loud than it is just thinking it through. Because when you do it out loud, you can also practice like where you might put your gestures and practice the eye contact and that sort of thing. So you might want to listen to it with the sound off, so that you're just watching your gestures and body language and seeing how that looks. And then you might want to just listen to it without watching it so you can see how your tone is, and then put it together. My boys are in college, and I always have them do that before they have to go give a speech. And it really makes a difference. And even practice in your bedroom. I used to practice, I'd put up stickies with smiley face, like that's my audience. And I'd practice my eye contact and my movement and my gestures. And I looked silly because my boys would come in once in a while and just laugh and laugh. But it works. So practice, practice, practice. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed being able to talk to you about this, because it's near and dear to my heart. And I am a communications and leadership coach. There's my email if you need to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I love talking about this stuff, so I'm happy to do it. So we've got a couple of minutes left for Q&A, and then I will stay behind for anybody who doesn't get their question asked. Yes?
So I've heard your neutral position was just on the side. Does that signal disinterest, though? That's what I've heard.
Disinterest is like this. Like, I don't really care. But this, and it's also that forward lean, like moving into the audience as well to show your interest. So what a lot of people do, especially when it gets to Q&A, it'll be like, so does anybody have any questions? You know, and you're moving back. It's moving in. So what questions do you have about the presentation today? So it's combining that movement, but with this, to show I'm ready. And it also, it's easier to gesture from there. Because if you get here, you get stuck. Or a lot of guys put the hands in the pockets or jingling their change, and then you get stuck there and you're not gesturing, which keeps energy high too. Yes?
So in a world
world where a lot of folks are on their phones while you're speaking in public. How do you address that, or do you address it?
Yeah, you know, that's a tough one because what that does is it sets up a wall and it doesn't allow for any kind of connection or eye communication. So depending on the forum, I'll often say, I mean, I've been a people manager many times, so whenever I had a meeting, I always say, okay, we're going to park the phones at the door. You know, we're going to turn those off. So if it's appropriate, you can say, hey, just so that, you know, this is time for you. I'm glad you gave up this time to make it really rewarding and less distracting for everybody else if you could shut off your phones. Sometimes I've said that. But there was one time where I was really bothered because this woman was on it the whole time, and it was kind of bugging me. And then afterwards, I realized she was taking notes on it. So then there's that. But those are some things that you could try because it does thwart connection and eye communication. Yeah.
Most of us have meetings with smaller groups, you know, like the groups of 5 to 15 people, either execs or your own team. Which adjustments or points that you have for that communication in that group? You're typically sitting down.
Sure.
When you're kicking off the meeting, presenting something.
Yeah. Well, what you would modify is some of the behaviors, they'd be smaller. So if you're like sitting down and you've just got a few people in the room, you're not going to want to be doing these bold, you know, well, you can't walk across the room, but you won't be doing these gestures or they're going to think, what is wrong with him? So, so you're going to modify it and make them just a little bit smaller, but you're still going to do it. The vocals should still be the same. You should still be going for that variety, trying to eliminate the non-words. And in terms of content, it should be about the same. You still want to have that structure, which is what's my big point of view here? What do I want them to do or think? And let me bring in some stories or examples and relevance. You know, what's the benefit to them? Why is this important? So content-wise, you're going to think it the same. In terms of the others, the behaviors, it's just modifying a little bit to tame them down. Does that help? Yeah. One last question. Yes.
Any best practices for remote teams, people that are either groups of remote or individual remotes that are like, you know, zooming in or whatever it may be with cameras on or whatever?
Yeah. Are you talking about situations where you've got some in the room and some remote, or everybody's remote? Okay, so both. Conference calls, that kind of thing?
Conference calls, you know, weekly, all hands, and things like that.
Yeah. Okay, so those are difficult inherently. I mean, we all know it's really tough to keep attention because are people riveted listening to you on a conference call? No, they're overlapping and doing all kinds of things, right? We know that. Probably walking the dog, too. But anyway, so some of the best things you can do is to, it spikes attention when it's not just your voice. So, and it also spikes attention when you start calling on people. So one thing I used to do when I was a manager is I would say, okay, John, could you give us a debrief on blah, blah, blah? Or Mary, what do you think about blah, blah, blah? Everyone else is then going, oh my God, she's calling on people. I've got to pay attention. So that's one thing you can do. I know when I do both, like if I have an audience here and I have my remote, you can't forget about the remote people because it's easy to do. So I always go to them first. I always go to them first, you know, and ask the questions. Those are a couple things off the top.
Is it unreasonable to require everybody to have their cameras on?
No, not if it's yours. I've done that.
I do it too. I just don't want
Oh yeah, so that you can see them?
I don't want to be the only jerk in the room, but it's super important to me.
No, it's super important.
Yeah, no. I actually, that's better, and it also keeps everybody else more attentive as well. First of all, you have to watch yourself because you're being watched, and it's also a lot, it gives you another dimension. So it increases attention on both ends. Yeah, absolutely.
I want to say it can be hard when it's like late at night for some people. It's a little bit trickier. Yeah.
So I guess being mindful of the time, huh? And the time zones. Yeah. Okay, I'm around if anybody has any further questions. Again, thank you. Really enjoyed working with you.